Hi everyone, this is Jeffrey, JGB146 Blake from Grinderschool.com, a small stakes poker training site, and we're partnering with WSOP.com to bring you some poker training videos. Today we're looking at a $5 sit and go played on WSOP.com recently, and again I want to start off just kind of illustrating how tight it's appropriate to be in the early stages of the game. So here you can see we have an ace-10. We're first to act at a full-handed table, and I just fold. I think this is the right decision to play most of the time. The reason being that we're out of position. We don't know what's going to happen from all of our players left at the table. Early on in these games, until you know the opponents you're playing against, it's very common to see bets and raises back and forth, and people even getting all in with fairly weak hands, pocket pairs and such, that still have a lot of equity against an ace-10, and it's really just way too early to need to gamble like that. So we're better off just preserving our chips. If we had been in late position, we probably would have raised this up. If we were at a six-handed table, we might have raised it as first act, and again, in later position we would have. But as the cards lie, it's just not worthwhile. If we were to raise here and we get re-raised, we have to let it go, and we've lost chips, even though we know that some players are going to be playing very, very loosely, very aggressively, with weak hands. We just don't want to be in that situation. We just don't want to bleed chips this early with weakish hands. So from this position, ace-10 is a pretty easy fold. If we had played it, we can see the very next player does raise. We don't know if he would have just called our raise or if he would have come over the top. But either way, unless we hit a perfect flop, it's going to be pretty tough on us to play the hand. So I'm not going to go through the entire hand, but I just want to highlight some of the difficulties that we have in playing kind of marginal hands out of position. It's something to completely avoid early on in the tournament, and we always want to be in later position so that our raises have to go through fewer players, and we can end up in that situation where we're against a small number of opponents. So the very next hand, we're dealt an ace-jack from the big blind. Obviously we're not folding this unless there's a raise, but if there is a raise, we would consider folding depending on where it came from and what we had seen of our opponents. Again, because we're out of position. If it had been a late position raise, we'd probably call. We definitely wouldn't 3-bet at this stage of the tournament, but we have to question how we're going to play things when there's there's so many people and we're so early in the game. Here, what ends up happening though is that everyone just kind of limps in. So we have a huge pot, lots of players, and I choose to go ahead and check. Again, this is because, well, A, there's so many people at the table. So we're going to hit the flop a fairly small number of times. It's about a third of the time that you'll make a pair on any given flop. So if we bet, we're building a big pot with a hand where we're out of position and we're early in the game and don't need to do so. That's not a situation I want to be in. I'd much rather be in a situation where if we hit the flop, great, we can build a pot then, but we don't need to do it ahead of time. If we were to bet here, we're probably going to be playing against most of these players. It's very unlikely that they're going to call the initial bet and then fold to a raise unless we make it a really big raise, and we don't want to do that from out of position here. So we'd still be in a multi-way pot, and the type of hand that we have here, an ace-jack, plays really well against one opponent, but not all that well against a full table. Unless we end up hitting and have a good board to play on. So all of that said, I think the right play here is to go ahead and check. We're not losing much if we end up missing the board completely, and our hand is also a little bit disguised. So if an ace comes out there, someone that has like an ace-5 that is limped in may go ahead and put some chips in to pay us off in a way that they wouldn't if we were to raise, and then they called the raise, saw the ace, they'd be able to get away more easily. So kind of a little bit of deception, a little bit of cautious play, but I think it's the right way to go this early in the game. So the flop comes out, and indeed it does have an ace on it. We go ahead and just bet out. Again, I'm expecting anyone with an ace to continue here. There's also potential of someone that has like a 4-3 suited or a 4-5 suited could continue with their straight draws. And other hands will come along too. Since there was no raise pre-flop, there are going to be some pocket pairs that continue that think, well, there was no raise, so clearly he doesn't have the ace. So I go ahead and bet out here just because I don't want it to check around if no one has an ace. So we go ahead, we bet, and we get a few folds and a call. The turn comes, and it's queen. This doesn't really change anything because obviously if our opponent had ace queen, he was already ahead of us, and he probably would have raised pre-flop. Sort of the same justification that we were saying we were ahead of basically any other ace. Well, he's ahead of us with an ace queen whether or not the queen is there, so it's not a danger card at all to us. It does bring another draw in the form of flush draw, which probably isn't going to hit his hand, but if he happened to have, like we said, the 4-5 suited, the 4-2 suited, and he happened to have hearts, he could continue further with that type of hand. We definitely want to bet here. We want to make the bet a little bit stronger because there are more ways he can call with a weak hand, with a draw. So that's what we do, and indeed he does call again. Now the river is a jack, which gives us two pair, but doesn't change really anything because, again, if he had ace queen, well, he'd still be beating us because he now would have a stronger two pair. If he had ace king, well, that's the one hand that was beating us before that is not now. But any other hand, I guess if he randomly had a 3-6 or ace 3, ace 6, those types of hands we're now beating that we weren't before. But it doesn't change much. We're betting here for strict value. He basically never has a king 10 here to have called on the flop and the turn. So we're betting for value, hoping he calls. We might have been able to make this bet a little bit smaller. Maybe like a 400 chip bet would have been a little bit better to get called a little bit more often. But I don't think there's anything wrong with this bet size. Turns out he does fold, and we take down the pot and add about 400 chips to our stack overall. So the next hand we play is a couple orbits later. You can note we folded a lot of hands before getting to this point, and blinds are now up from the 1020 level to 5100. With blinds increasing that much, it's definitely a spot where we're going to want to play more hands, be a bit more aggressive. We're going to start raising more marginal spots and potentially start stealing in good positions to do so. With that in mind, we're still in early position. It's not first to act the way it was in the very first hand, but we have an ace 10 suited, and now we're definitely going to be raising this hand. So that's what we do. We raise, we get one caller, and the rest of the table folds. So the flop comes down. It's a wonderful flop for us. We have the ace high flush draw. We have a pair. There's very little that our opponent can have to put us in trouble here. Even if he has a stronger pair with a jack, we're still in good shape with our ace high flush draw, with the potential to get two pair. So we're betting out here about a half pot bet. It's as much a value bet as anything. We don't mind if he folds, but we're perfectly happy if he calls as well. There's very little he can have that has us in a lot of trouble here. He could, of course, have a straight, but even there, we have two streets to come for our flush. So even with the worst case scenario where he has a straight, we could still easily end up hitting our flush. It's about 30% of the time we'll do that. So we're willing to really pretty much commit with this strong a board. He just calls, and on the turn there is an ace. Now we have two pair. Our hand's even stronger. Sure, there are now a few more straights that he could have, but there's no way we can get away from this hand. There's not enough chips in our stack. So we go ahead, we bet out. He raises. This could be an indication that he has an ace. It could be an indication that he has a better hand, but with the strength of our hand, we're never getting away here. So naturally, we get all in, and he calls, and he shows that he has the ace king. Really, his call on the flop was pretty marginal. All he had was a gut shot and some overcards, and at this point, there's one card in the deck. I guess 2 cards in the deck that he can get to beat us, the kings that are not hearts. Or I guess potentially he could get queens to he could hit a queen to get a straight. So he has a little bit of equity, but we almost have this hand lock up. Nothing happens on the river, and we take it down. Now the next hand that we highlight here, it's another hand that we're in early position because we just doubled up. We now have almost 5,000 chips, and we can look around the table and see that several of the opponents are getting fairly short. So what that means is that they're going to be playing a lot of hands. They're going to be betting back and forth, and it's really not a situation that we need to be involved in, risking our chips again from this early position. If we were the last to act, if we were in the blinds and we could decide based on how they'd played what type of hands to expect from them, there's a lot of chance that we'd be playing this ace-jack against several of the players at the table. We'd clearly be delighted to play it against the short stack driven here, probably against JHG. But from this early position, there's really just no reason with our stack size that we need to get involved. It wouldn't be a big mistake to go ahead and raise here since everyone else is kind of short, but they're going to be gambling it up more than we necessarily need to. Ace-jack is a strong hand, but it's not a monster. About an orbit later, you can see we're dealt middle position a queen-jack. Here, blinds are up a little bit further to 75, 150, and this is a spot where we really have enough skin in the game now. Stealing the pot is starting to be worthwhile, so I think we're good here. Later position, we're good to go ahead, make a raise. Even though it's a weaker hand, there's more chips in the pot, and we're in later position, so we have fewer opponents to kind of deal with. So we go ahead here and make a little bit of a raise, and we get one call. So not a bad result. We'd obviously rather get folds, but we don't hate it. The flop comes out. It's a pretty blank board. It is connected with lower cards and flush cards, but most of the time in sit and goes, it's going to pay off to make a continuation bet. So I go ahead, I do that here. We get a call from our opponent. Our bet was a little marginal because there are a lot of draws here. Our opponents are probably going to be more inclined to call, but I do know that as we get later into sit and goes, I've observed at these games on WSOP.com, particularly, our opponents are very frequently inclined, as you get later in the games, to just fold any board that they didn't hit. So we could have skipped the continuation bet, but I don't mind making it either. We're probably going to be giving up now that we've been called, though, unless we hit something later. Here, the next card comes out, doesn't change anything for us. It actually is a little bit more dangerous because a few cards, anything that had a 6 in it is now a straight, and we just don't have enough to call this all in. So we're going ahead, we're going away. Like I say, we might have done better to have skipped the bet on the flop there, but we still have a pretty healthy stack, so we're not in trouble by any means. The next hand that we play is about an orbit and a half later. We're in the small blind with a king 9. Our stack hasn't changed much. We've just gone through the blinds a little bit. Blinds have gone up again to 150, 300, and at this point, we have under 10 times the big blind. There's 600 chips in the starting pot, so if it if we're given the opportunity to steal from late position, we're going to do it with a pretty wide range. If we're blind versus blind, we're going to be trying to take it down unless we think we have a strong enough hand to actually play for value. So we're definitely getting to the point that we're going to gamble it up, even though there's some smaller stacks at the table. Blinds are getting big enough, the starting pot is big enough that we want to really start growing our stack and avoid blinding out. So here it's folded around to us and we just shove all in, again looking to take down that pot, increase our 2700 chip stack by 600 chips with a hand that even if our opponent does call, we have a lot of equity against many of the hands he could have. So we're happy with the result where he folds and we get an extra 600 chips, but we wouldn't have even really minded all that much if he had called, as long as he's not totally destroying us. You can see here that there's a Queen 9 suited hand that I'm not showing. I just want to touch on that a little bit. If it had been folded to us we would have been on the button in that hand. If it had been folded to us, we would have played it. We probably would have shoved with it, trying to get all in. But in that particular hand, someone else went and shoved all in before us. And it's not a hand that we wanted to call with without any skin in the game. So here, again, still in the same situation with the stack sizes, still in the same situation with the starting pot. We have slightly more chips, but not very many more. Still right around that 10 times the big blind level, and with the antes out there, that sort of makes our stack effectively a bit shorter. We have ace king, definitely a powerhouse hand, definitely a hand we wouldn't mind getting some action on, but we've already shown that with our stack in this kind of range, we are willing to shove all in. So if we start changing our pattern, if we start just betting smaller here, chances are good that we're betraying a little bit about our hand strength, and our opponents may pick up on that. So I go ahead, I shove all in again here. We'd definitely be happy getting a call, but again, picking up an extra 600 chips is not a bad result. That'll put us at almost 4,000 chips, and that's, anytime you can grow your stack that substantially, it's a good thing. We do get folds, we take down the pot, but we're in good shape. Here with the ace-4 on the button, again we're shoving all in. We've gone through the blinds, and you can see we've lost about 600 chips going through that last orbit. So we're still in that sort of desperate stage. It's definitely a pot that we want to take down if we can. Again, we'd be stealing with a fairly wide range here, and any ace is certainly worth playing. We do take down the blinds, and we're happy about that. And a couple of hands later, one player has busted. We've still got the super short stack here, and we have a king jack. So this is a spot I finally start to deviate from the raise sizes that we've been playing. Part of this is because we're on the button. We're playing against the blind of the biggest stack player at the table. King jack is a strong enough hand to play, but I'm hoping that we can start continuing to build our stack up, get a little bit more aggressive throughout the rest of the game, and as that happens, we'll be able to grow our stack, step back away from shoving all in, and not risking all of our chips against the big stack. So we make a smaller raise here, 2.5 times the big blind, and we see what's going to happen. If we had faced a lot of resistance, obviously if we had lost that pot, we'd have 3,000 chips left, and we'd have to be back to shoving, unless we called and won. But as is, we've grown our stack. If we can keep up a fairly aggressive game, we can start to really continue growing that and not have to risk as much when we're making these steals. So a few hands later, we're in the big blind with Jack 9 suited. This is a hand that we would certainly play against the short stack opponent here with the odds we'd be getting if he shoved. If he just calls, we'll shove against him. What we would do against the bigger stack opponents would depend a little bit. As it turns out, it doesn't matter. Everyone folds to us, and we love that result. So here, it's again folded around. We're seeing a pretty tight table. We know there's a super short player here, and what that means is that we can start applying a lot of pressure to the next shortest stack. Eventually, he's going to become desperate and start calling widely. Right now, he has enough chips to be comfortable. So in this situation, we can afford to shove very widely, to steal chips very, very frequently from him. And note, there's 400, 600, 850 chips out there. Even with our, strong stack, we're second in chips, but just barely. Even with it, we're, getting a lot of chips. We're increasing our stack size by almost 15% by taking down the pot preflop. So we're happy to do so. It's going to be extremely hard for him to call because he is going to minimally want to outlast this opponent. He's going to be much more inclined to be shoving his own hands than calling us loosely. It works out, and we've grown our stack to the point that we are now the chip leader. So here we have an ace, but the other big stack player has limped in ahead of us. A lot of times in these games, limps from the first person to act can be really strong hands trying to trap, so we don't really want to get involved there. We'd rather just go ahead, let him do what he's doing, and potentially let him knock out one of the other players. So we're just going to go ahead and fold. We don't want to get involved in a pot that gets us in trouble. We're in a great situation already. Turns out, a blank flop comes out and he makes a big bet. He could just be bullying, but he could have had a big hand and realized no one made a stab at it pre-flop, so now he has to play aggressively to try to get value. Either way, not a situation we want to be involved in, so we're happy we folded. And the very next hand, we get pocket queens. Short stack folds. Here, we're definitely going to be raising. Obviously, we're happy to get it all in against anyone at the table. So we make a raise, again, because we've been making those smaller raises with that ace king, with our king jack, and even, well, I guess 6-9 we shoved, but that was against the short stack player. Making the smaller raises, we're going to be inclined to get more action. That's sort of what we'd like. We'd really like to see someone shove in over the top of us, and there are a lot of players who will do that. So as it is, we get a call from the other big stack player. That's not even a bad result with our queens. Okay, the flop comes out, and there is an overcard. There's a king on the table, but the chances that our opponent has that king are fairly low. The pot is so large that we really aren't going to be able to get away from this. So we're definitely going to make a bet here, and he just goes away. If he had called, we would have proceeded cautiously. If he had shoved, it would have been a tough spot, but I don't know that we could get away because I think that he can consider this board to be a good board to make some bluffs on with a lot of draws, and potentially he can have like a jack and think that he's good. So doesn't matter. We end up taking it down with our queens, and we're in good shape going forward. We're now a significant chip leader. So in the hand you didn't see, Mason X limped and then called a shove with pocket sevens against the short stack player. The short stack player ended up with pocket queens and doubled up. And really with a hand like pocket sevens, that's not really a play you want to make. You'd rather be shoving all in and have the fold equity to pick up the large pot than to be encouraging your opponents to play a pot with you. You're only going to be about a coin flip against most hands. So we get a shove here from the player under the gun. We have a queen deuce, and we have to evaluate where things are at now. So there's a total of 3,100 chips in the pot, and we're gonna have to call about 2,000 chips to win that. It's really a marginal situation at best. If he had been a bit shorter, if he had 1,000 chips, we would easily call here. We know that he's shoving fairly widely. We've seen that at this point, that he's shoving in pretty aggressively, and he should be. But with our chip lead, it's probably still not worth it to call with just the queen high with deuce kicker. Next hand, we get 5-6, we get a shove and a call. Obviously this is an easy fold, but I wanted to show it to you because it's interesting. We see 3s versus 8s. This is great for us. We definitely like one of these players to bust out. It would leave 2 short stack players on the bubble, and that gives us a situation that we can definitely manipulate for our advantage. The pocket 8s hold up, and we are on the bubble four-handed. We have a strong stack. So here I fold an 8-7 from the button. I do this because we have seen a couple of times now that Mason X actually is inclined to call smaller bets and try to play post flop, and we don't really want that. We want to be able to steal, and we're probably going to have our most effective steal opportunities when we're faced just against this player, blind versus blind. So we're just going to hold back. We don't want to get overly involved against the other big stack when we're in a really good situation as it is. So we have a decision to make here. We could go ahead and raise it up and try to take it down pre-flop, build a big pot, and potentially get a lot out of that. But again, we have 2 short stack players involved in the hand. We have a pretty comfortable stack. Our other big stack player is pretty comfortable, and we know that he will mix it up. He will call bets, and it's really just more risk than we need to take on right now, given where stack sizes line up. It wouldn't be bad to raise here, but I think playing it cautiously and just going ahead and checking is okay too. We can evaluate how he's going to play post flop too, and see if we need to start taking these pots away pre-flop, or if we can get value post flop, and just kind of judge how that's going to go. So with that said, I choose to go ahead and check here. You could check or raise either way. Once we've checked post flop, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to get overly involved without hitting something. We can probably call one bet from our opponent because we're probably ahead of a lot of his hands, but also this board, it has straight draws, it has flush draws, it has a jack in there that it's going to potentially be in his hand. There's a lot of ways that he's going to call if we start betting out. A lot of hands he can have to really be ahead of us, and we don't get enough value from it. So I think checking this down unless we hit is probably okay. In the future we might go ahead and be more aggressive with it. But again, with this opponent that has 2 blinds left in his stack, it's really, really bad if we were to somehow bust out. So we want to play conservatively. We want to avoid risking a lot of chips with these 2 guys in the hand. So we check. We do hit the river. I go ahead and make a half pot bet there. That's a value bet. We're hoping to just get a call. As it is, we take the pot down, and that's a good result. So here with the ace-7, once Mason X has folded, we're committed in this hand. We're going to be playing all in against any opponent that's involved. Basically, we're shoving no matter what Driven does, and not really caring what the result is. JHG folds here, and with 2,000 chips, that's pretty questionable. He can currently outlast Driven. but Driven can take down one pot, and then JHG is in trouble. With the amount of chips in his stack, he should be calling pretty wide here, but he's not, and that's good for us. That actually makes us inclined to want Driven to be involved further so we can continue growing our stack at JHG's expense. Now we can see the very next hand, Driven shoves all in for not even, it's not even a full raise. It's just under 1.5 times the big blind. Here I choose to fold, and part of the reason I'm doing that is because, as we saw on the last hand, JHG is going to make the situation with having Driven in the game, he's going to make it very profitable for us. So we'd almost prefer Driven to stay in at this point, just to help us grow our stack and be more prepared for three-handed play, for heads-up play. So now Mason X folded, and that was a horrible play. He's not being aggressive enough to take advantage of the situations that are offered, and he's getting such good odds there. He had to call 280 chips to win a pot of 2,000 chips. There is literally not a hand in the deck that he could hold that is bad enough against any hand that Driven could hold to justify not taking that risk. The next hand, we folded Queen Deuce suited. This would have been a good hand to steal, but we know that JHG is going to be likely to get involved. We know Driven is going to be likely to get involved because of their stack size, and it's not a strong enough hand that we want to be, basically heads up against them without needing to, without being the aggressor. We could have shoved, but a shove against people with these stack sizes is almost the same as a call. Indeed, JHG shoves, and we get a call from Mason X. So we get a Jack 9, we get pocket 9s. Jack 9 was a good play, good shove from JHG. He got unlucky to be facing pocket 9s, and unfortunately he does not get lucky. I say unfortunately because while it's nice to be breaking the bubble, it's nice to be three-handed with one short stack player. The situation when it's four-handed on this particular bubble would have been great for us to continue building our stack even more. Queen 5, we're not going to get out of line when other players have played, and we're just going to go away. So with the Queen 7 suited here, most of the time in a three-handed situation, I would be raising this. Especially with the blinds as high as they are. However, because Driven is so short stacked, it's really not, our equity in the tournament is so much more than what the value of this hand would be if we were to get in a big pot against Mason X. So we want to play fairly conservatively until Driven either doubles up or busts out. So we just call, and we hit a great flop. In that we have a gut shot for a straight draw, we have a flush draw. At this point, we have enough equity in the hand over cards. We would go ahead and risk everything here. There's enough ways that we could win it if Mason X actually has something, and enough. It's fairly rare that he's going to have something with just holding random cards. So we make a bet. We'd much rather not get all of our chips in the middle, but we're not going away at this point. He just folds. He's not trying to get too uppity with the short stack here either. So now we can see Driven is all in for just the cost of the blinds. We're just calling here. King 8 is a very strong hand to be playing against a player that's all in, but our preferred result would actually be that Mason X calls as well, so it's the three of us all together. Driven has a maximum chance of being busted out, and really Mason X should be doing that as well because he's going to profit from that situation quite a bit as well. It's a much stronger chance of Driven busting out if Mason X calls, and there are two hands that Driven has to beat instead of just one. He doesn't, he folds, and it ends up that Driven has a pretty strong hand. Unfortunately for him, we get lucky and end up heads up. So here with the 10-3, we're happy to see Mason X fold to us. With a King 10 from the button, it's a very easy raise. Blinds are not high enough that we have to shove all in. However, if Mason X were to shove over the top of us here, we would probably call, because King 10 is a pretty strong hand heads up. He doesn't, he folds. So far, we see just a call here from Mason X, and what we're kind of concluding is that he's going to be not as aggressive as he probably should be for heads up. That's good for us. With 6-4, it's almost bad enough that I want to raise as a bluff here, but not quite, because I don't want to establish a pattern just yet of Mason X thinking that he can't ever limp our blinds, because it's much better for us if he does. So I check here basically to encourage him to continue limping. And if I don't get lucky, I'm probably just going to go away. That's certainly a horrible flop, and we just check fold. So Jack 4 suited, much weaker hand than the King 10 we had an orbit ago, but definitely strong enough to be raising heads up, especially against a player that's playing more passively like Mason X. So we're happy to raise here. We mostly want to get folds, but that's what happens and it works. Here with our 10-3, again, Mason X chooses to call, and we just check. Again, this is a spot that our hand is almost bad enough to justify raising, just so we don't have to play a pot with a weak hand out of position. When we don't do that, the flop comes down, and we're just going to check it through. And then the very next hand, we get an 8 deuce suited. Since I've been raising from the button pretty much every hand, I go ahead and just call here, just to kind of mix things up, just to continue the dance, as it were. But we're going to be betting most flops if he checks to us. This is certainly one we'll bet, and we take it down. So we finally get a raise from Mason X. This is about the time that I'm actually thinking to myself, well, if he just limps, I'm going to raise no matter what I hold. Then he raises, and since he hasn't raised, we're certainly not going to be doing anything spunky here. We're just going to get out of the way. So with pocket kings, I choose to just call. This was really a mistake. I've been aggressive enough on the button that I think we can expect Mason X to call a little bit wider than he should, and potentially come over the top of us. But I called because he's been so passive. I want to encourage him to play back at us some. I think that was a bit of a mistake. I think I'm giving him more credit than I should. So this should have been a raise. I'm getting a little bit too fancy by just calling here. He checks. We hit a great board, and I don't mind the check there on the flop because we have 3 of a kind. Sure, there are hands that Mason X can hold that are going to have some equity, but the chances of him checking with them are pretty low since it went check check pre-flop. So I checked, and I think that's fine. Then the turn comes, and he checks again. I'm betting for value at this point. Obviously, again, the jack comes and completes a straight. That's not a big concern because most of the time, I think, with a hand that strong, Mason X would have bet. He certainly would have bet into us on the turn. So we're really still hoping for a call, but Mason X goes ahead and folds. Ten 4, he just folds to us. That's great. So note the chip stacks here now. Mason X went into this heads-up battle and he was ahead of us. He had the big stack. But because we've been aggressive and we've taken down some pots that we shouldn't have, and because he's been passive, we've managed to attain the chip lead now. Here with this 3-5, we go ahead, we make a raise. It's a min raise because blinds are so big that that's reasonable. And for once he's going to call us. That's not great for us, but when he checks, he's showing a lot of weakness. We potentially could have gone ahead and bet here, but we've seen, like in the king's hand, he does not tend to go ahead and bluff on boards that look dangerous, boards that look like they could hit a pre-flop raise. So we check behind. We're going to bet the turn no matter what, unless he bets it. So we do so, we take it down. So this 10-8, this is another situation where if he had limped, we probably would have just shoved because of the size of the pot and the blinds. But again, he folds to us. He's folding way too much for heads-up play. With the 10-3, if he hadn't called us pre-flop when we had the 3-5 last orbit, I would have stolen here. I would have just raised to try to take it down. But as it is, he did that, so I didn't want to get involved with a weak hand, especially since he's giving us so many pots. It's just not worth it. Okay, so here we have an ace-5. Mason X has again gone ahead and limped. And this is the situation we've kind of been looking for. We have a strong enough hand to justify raising, justify committing. And we're just going to shove here. It's possible that he has something. He's been folding to a lot of our blinds, but it doesn't matter. We have an ace. We can't afford to let this pot play out cheaply. We also have enough of a stack that if we lose, we're still not necessarily out of the game. We raise, he calls, and the board comes down, giving us two pair. Sure, Mason X could have a stronger ace, he could have a queen, but he's going to have a lot of other hands, and the fact that the board is paired actually helps us because he's going to call with some pocket pairs that he probably shouldn't. Given that we raised pre-flop, it's iffy as to whether he should play pocket pairs. I go ahead and check because I'm willing to commit and I don't think this board is dangerous, and he makes a bet. Now at this point, I'm probably going to go ahead and just get it all in. I do, I raise, and he calls. With eights, it's unlikely that I would have taken the check raise all in play with total air, so there's very little chance that his eights are good, but at the same time, there's so much in the middle between the 5,000 chip pot, the 800 that was out there. He's going to be left with 3,000 chips if he folds, so I don't fault him for calling there, hoping that I have a weaker pair. I think it's unlikely that I do, but I think that he's going to be in too tough a spot if he folds. Thankfully, my hand holds up, and we win the tournament. With that, we'll go ahead, wrap things up for the day. For more poker training, subscribe to grinderschool.com and use the discount code WSOP25 to save 25% on your first subscription.